Hi, everyone. Today, we are here with one of our partners at Onal Galant, Saeed Ertekin. Saeed heads the transactional department here at Onal Galant. Saeed came from Big Law, has vast experience in commercial transactions, and today we're going to dive into startups, right? What are startups? What are the best ways for startups to raise capital? What kind of business structures they should form? How do startups protect their intellectual property? And many other topics. And if you do have other questions that you'd like us to cover in our future episodes, please write them in the comment section. And don't forget to subscribe and follow. Welcome. How are you?
Good, and you?
Good. Thank you. So let's start up with, the most basic. What legal structure should I choose for my startup?
I think it's a very common question, but at the same time, I think sometimes it causes unnecessary confusion for people. Start with what you need for your startup. A lot of times, forming an LLC, limited liability company, is a lot easier. And that might be all you need, because when you talk about startups, you are thinking about billion-dollar companies, or great valuations, exits, and so on. But actually, there's a huge work that goes into it at the beginning. And for that, sometimes 2, 3, 4 years, if you're going to be alone, there's really no need to create the complicated structures such as C corporation. So an LLC would be more than enough at that point. But if you are going to hire people, if you want to issue stock to those employees so that they're incentivized to work on the company, because especially as a small startup, even if you have funding, and especially before you get funding, the only incentive is just selling people a vision for future, selling that we are going to get bigger. Now I can't pay you much, but this equity in this company is going to be worth a lot more in the future. So for that structure, a C corporation is a lot more appropriate than an LLC structure.
Okay, so based on, your experience, I know you worked at Big Law. Most of these startups, what percentage of startups end up with a C Corp and what percent with the LLC?
I mean, to be perfectly honest, by the time they can afford the rates of Big Law, they already get some funding or they have some traction in terms of at least through their product, even if they are bootstrapped. So by then, 100%, not even 99%, of those startups were C corporations. But that's why I made the distinction. When people think about startup, it's really a specific kind of company that has explosive growth potential. But I also worked on transactions that were simple LLCs that over years, with more traditional business models with brick and mortar store sales or manufacturing, having factories and so on, became hundreds of $1 million worth or $1 billion worth, and then that were sold with a single owner or sometimes maybe 2, 3 owners max. So that also works perfectly fine. It really depends on what is the value that you're selling, offering, and what are your needs in that regard, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. It does. One of the biggest concerns with most startups is that, I have this crazy idea, crazy good idea. I want to make sure no one steals it, right?
Yeah.
And especially this can be, sometimes the people you're working on the project with. And so one of the first things you want to do if you have an idea that's poised for explosive growth, you want to make sure you can protect that intellectual property.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
So what do you recommend for these people who have a startup idea and, they want to protect this so no one steals it, even their friends or former business partners, we know with Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, right? All these lawsuits happen for a reason, right? And so what do you recommend for those who are starting up right now?
I think it's an excellent question, and let's dissect it. One thing that I'm going to just illuminate quickly is a lot of people have, this fantasy oh man, I had this great idea for some of most successful companies. I wish I had put it in action, and sometimes they are under the illusion that they can get some money because they had that idea first. I'm sorry, but just the idea alone without creating a product is not worth more than just that pleasant feeling that you have for a few, seconds, minutes, or maybe years. In a more serious note, when you have an idea, there's a difference between, whether that idea is viable or that idea is just nice for some time, but it's unlikely to have any commercial success. Like regardless, like commercial success, like that's why I want to highlight, because it's very different than the idea actually being a real idea that might be helpful for humanity, but like maybe no one's gonna ever buy it. So first you need to decide like where you want to use it. The reason why I want to make that distinction is the kinds of valuable ideas in academic circles. For example, if you are a PhD student, like in MIT, Harvard, or like elsewhere, and then you have an amazing idea that would help healthcare in general, or like just some very specific disease, that is obviously you need to protect your idea, but like that is different than trying to find the next best software or like app that's gonna hook people up, like everyone's gonna be addicted. That's very different than like that consumer facing product or software. So if you are in academia and you're gonna work in someone's lab, so you need to be careful about like what kind of agreements you sign with people. A lot of times, whether you work for a company or a lab like in a university under a professor, your work product belongs to your employer. So that's the first thing.
So it belongs to the university. Right?
Belongs to the university.
Or the lab.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Or belongs to the employer, like let's say in the tech sector, because for example, also Google, Facebook, and like some other big companies actually employ a lot of researchers that are not doing anything commercial, like at least on the surface. Their work products technically all belong to
those companies.
Right. And there's a like weird dynamic there, because if you believe that's something that you would like to capitalize on in the future, then you should work on those ideas on your own time with your own devices, including your own laptop and so on, without using the employer's resources, and not during the work time, because what you do during work time really belongs to the employer. That's the first part.
So number one is to make sure that you do things on your own time.
Exactly.
Okay.
And with your own resources.
Gotcha.
Like, I mean, time is a resource as
well.
Own
time and own resources.
Yes. Like,
gotcha.
I use that example. Like, I think a lot of people nowadays just rely on their work laptop, for example.
Right.
Even that is a
if you're trying to start up something, you know,
correct.
Most
I
likely,
understand, but like really, just that's why I'm making that warning. Like, so.
Well, that's where, you know, in a lawsuit,
exactly,
that's what comes up, right?
Yeah.
And what resources did you use?
Yeah.
Where did you spend this time, you know, to find this idea?
Yeah. But something tricky there is like no employer can own the know-how, like meaning like let's say you work in a lab, you learn like how to do very sophisticated things in connection with biophysics or neurology or like something that is pretty close to rocket science, like literally or, you know, like figuratively. But then you can definitely use that knowledge and then like apply it somewhere else that you think will be more successful commercially. Or you can try to pitch that idea to a potential investor. Like there are a lot of startup incubators like that accept applicants just based on an idea. And you can just say like, I have this idea, but I need a place where I can work on it. And then like you can do that. So that's totally fine.
Okay. So initially, you know, during the research phase, make sure it's on your own time and with your own resources.
Correct.
What other steps?
So the reason why I wanted to start with that, like just for especially in pharmaceutical industry or in the health space, like just some of these researches can take easily 8, 10, 15 years. And during this entire process, some investor need to really fund it. I mean, we just hear about like the success stories, but there are actually a lot of like failures during that time, like either because of running out of funds or
most startups fail, correct?
Well, that is true as well. Like regardless of
what's
sector.
the percentage?
I don't have the official data, but I think the percentage is like easily like I believe like over 90 or 95% or so. Like just
that's not bad. 5-10%, you know.
Well, 5-10% do not fail, but like just the startups that become like, you know, that have those like explosive successes is like less than 1%.
Right, of course.
And that's also the business model for like venture capitals, to like the way they invest. Like let's say over a year, the venture capital raises funds. They say like, you know, we have this vision, like we want to invest in AI companies now or gaming companies or like whatnot. And then the investors believe in their vision, they invest. And what they try to find is trying to find the next Facebook. Like, so what that means is that's why they are taking sometimes crazy risks. And that's why like they're looking at the founders, their backgrounds, and just like whether the industry is ripe for, you know, potential growth. And if there's unfortunately also hype around that, because like sometimes certain things are hype, like such as it might be a little like controversial. So for example, crypto sector like was extremely hot 2-3 years ago, and now I don't want to say it's dead, but like it's not in a great spot. So
a lot of people are gonna have
So
thoughts about that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So now
they
like,
say
AI
they
is-
say hodl.
Yeah, that's true. I like anyways. I think crypto is a subject for a different day.
Yeah.
And a different
No, we'll
conversation, but,
tackle that, and
Yes.
I want to hear your thoughts.
Sure. So there's the academia part, but then let's go like to consumer facing apps, or like even if it's B2B, like just someone sitting in their garage or like just the basement and then really working on
The
something.
stories that we hear.
Exactly.
Okay.
Like more common stories, like that do not require almost anything more than laptop and coding knowledge, or like some some knowledge about the business industry that they are working on. I want to qualify that coding knowledge because like today, especially like with ChatGPT or like other AI tools, there are a lot of tools that allow potential founders to code without like significant coding knowledge. So I think that's also gonna significantly revolutionize the startup space in general, and allowing people to come up with new tools, new apps, new software, new products, like without significant coding knowledge and without necessarily needing a co-founder that is technically like very knowledgeable. So we'll see. So for those startups, like what is very important, especially what causes the disputes between friends, for example, is not having a clear understanding and agreement between the founders, like how they are gonna share the responsibilities at the beginning, and who's gonna, let's say, like code, and who's gonna do the business development, or who's gonna do even for like coding like different aspects of the website, and who's gonna do the backend development. And there's resentment afterwards saying like I did more work or I did less work, and or just like my work was more valuable, and they didn't agree upfront whether the company was going to be 50-50 or 60-40 and so on.
So one recent IPO companies, right, Reddit, had a similar situation when they were starting up. Can you briefly explain what happened? What could they have done at the beginning to make sure that no one was hurt, basically, or no one, who had a legal right to something wasn't able to collect it because they couldn't evidence it in a court of law?
Well, I think another aspect is like not just no one would be wrong, but like what caused resentment between founders is like, let's say they have equal rights, but then one of the founders just stops working on the company and the others cannot force the other to work on it. So for example, for Reddit, Steve Hoffman and Alexis Ohanian are, like very well known. There was a third founder who died in 2013. He was an activist. He got involved in WikiLeaks and like just some criminal aspects he became an activist after they made some money, like when Reddit was initially sold to Condé Nast. Like it's a very big media company. But the argument was rooted in the fact that he had ownership in the company. He initially worked in the company, but then he lost interest and he didn't get involved in actually growing the company. And then the other founders like were trying to push him, but like there was some legal battle. And so that's why it's very important to clarify what will be the involvement of the founders throughout the life cycle of the startup, and what happens if one of them does not give 100% of his time. And that's also the reason why even for founders, a lot of times investors require a vesting schedule, meaning let's say even after being diluted, after getting some investment, the investors require founders not to get like all the stock that they are entitled to right away, but instead for them to, usually it's like over a period of 4 years, wait, like, and usually for the first year they don't get anything, and then they get all 1/4 at the end of first year, and then 1/48 after each month, like for the next 3 years. So that's to make sure that the incentives are aligned. Basically, it's very, very important to make sure that all those expectations are papered at the beginning of the startup's life cycle.
Gotcha. So what happened with Reddit was that they didn't have an agreement at the
Not
outset?
at the beginning, yes.
Okay. What? Like there were three buddies just said,
and then
hey,
they
we
did
have this
have
cool
agreement
idea.
because like just everyone had great backgrounds, but The third founder just lost interest like after initially like the company was sold to Condé Nast, but like they actually continued to grow after that sale. And earlier this year, just they had an IPO.
So what happened to the third?
Well, he died in 2013.
Okay, and what happened to his rights?
So that's the thing. Like just he was bought out all the way. I don't remember the exact year, but like just early on after the sale to Condé Nast. But like just what caused some friction over there was like, he was technically legally one of the founders, had ownership, but other founders like just...
they did more work.
They did more work and they continued to work full time, whereas he did not. And
did he get equal percentage?
Initially, yes, but then afterwards, not. Like it didn't continue like that. Because it wasn't fair to the other founders like who continue to work full time on that.
Okay. What do you think are the must-haves in any founders agreements that people who are on the verge of a startup should include?
I think top things that I can think of are one, obviously, is equity distribution. Especially if there are more than one founder, it's very important to have a clear understanding like who's going to own what, and then like sometimes, people prefer having equal ownership. Sometimes for some reason, just they prefer that one person have like 60 and the other 40, or like if there are three founders, like different distribution. Like just clarifying that so that everyone's on the same page. Second, together with that ownership percentage, like what responsibilities each of them is going to have. So like it might be a software company, but sales or business development is a huge like aspect of that company or that startup or for their success, because there are a lot of people who are geniuses like for, let's say, coding or like some technical aspect, but they are very uncomfortable in social environments, or like for raising funds from investors, or like just approaching potential customers and selling the product. So the other part is important, but like, founders need to be on the same page about like how they're going to share the ownership in that regard. And then another aspect is like vesting schedule. So like a very common rule of thumb is just over 4 years. And then that 4 years is like just like 1 year period where none of the stock vests, and then every month like an additional portion vests for the next like 3 years. So basically like 1/4 at the end of the first year, and then the 3/4 like is just at the end of every month like the relevant portion. I mean, it's not a legal rule. It's possible to change it. It's now like there are more and more startups like that try to extend it to 5 or more years. And the reason for that is in the past, especially like, during the boom times, most startups were doing their IPO like shortly after the 4-year mark, or like somewhat around that. And the goal was, okay, just stick around until IPO, then everyone's gonna, get their share, and then you can use that money to do something else, like either different startup or live your life. But now it takes much longer for startups to, even if they are successful, like to go to IPO. And for some startups, they just prefer to remain private for one reason or another. They want to keep more control over the company, or just they would prefer that because like once you're a public company, you are under a lot more scrutiny, and they just don't want that scrutiny. So, and I think the last part that I can think of is the IP rights. Like a lot of founders do not realize that even if they do the work, the value needs to be in the company, because none of the investors like invest in founder X. They want to invest in the company. That's why there needs to be clear paperwork for the IP ownership in the company. So like they need to make sure that they assign the IP rights to the company. And beyond themselves, like a huge mistake that I've seen countless founders do is to save on costs, they work with contractors or like other, let's say like part-time employees and so on, which is totally fine. But they don't have paperwork for the IP ownership. Like they just say, okay, I'm going to pay you $20 or $30 per hour, especially in, like I said, developing countries. It's good money for the person who is doing the work. So both sides are happy. But then let's say a significant portion of the code, like for the website or for the product, is written by someone overseas, and there's no IP ownership like trails. So like paperwork was not in place. They just never thought that it was important. And that becomes a problem once the investors start looking around and then wait, like just, what are we buying? Like just, who is the owner of this? Like, how do we make sure that the company has 100% ownership of all this intellectual property?
Oh, interesting. So people who, who work on, for example, say code overseas, sometimes end up saying, this is my work product?
Yes.
Oh.
Because especially if the company, like, becomes valuable afterwards, What do they have to lose? Nothing. One thing that I'm going to add over there is just, especially if there's a critical like step that is nearing, like it can be obviously like an investment, or sometimes like let's say acquisition by a bigger company. They're like, you know what, we don't want to spend a year developing what you developed. You're just going to buy it, and we have enough money, and then just like move on. And during that period, like an employee who wasn't happy with, like, let's say just like their compensation just comes up, and then the selling company just want to pay them off, even if they might not be able to, the employee or the contractor wouldn't be able to prove it. They just don't want to lose the time. They don't want to lose the deal. So they just pay that person off, and that person gets paid a lot more than what they would have been entitled, like under a contractual relationship. That's
interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Kind of transitioning from that, right? You want to be able to protect your IP rights. And so the people that you have working on your startup, you need to make sure that all your agreements are ironclad, right? And so what should startups consider when drafting employment contracts to make sure, one, that they're protecting their assets, and two, to make sure that there's no misunderstanding going forward or in the future?
Couple different things. And obviously this is not a legal advice. Again, like just every startup founder or like just people who would need like information, they would need to reach out to a lawyer to get like a tailored legal advice. But most common mistakes are not thinking about intellectual property. And the reason why I keep coming back to that is for a lot of startups, when you don't have any physical assets, your most valuable asset is the IP that you are producing, either with code or just like the idea for that business model or business, like just whatever you are doing. So the ownership over there, and making sure that whatever the employee does, because especially at the beginning, like a lot of startups are not able to pay significant money to the employees. So a lot of time that employee is part-time, or maybe it's just a contractor and so on. And then like they don't really think about the next steps because they are just thinking about survival, or just like, let me just have some viable product, or like sometimes it's called like MVP. It's like minimum viable product.
Not most valuable player?
No.
Okay.
So like, meaning like just a product that has the minimum features that would attract attention, like by the potential consumers, just to understand the interest, or to understand, okay, should I just kill this now before like I spend more resources and time and money, or like pivot to something that becomes more profitable. And during that period, for example, like that other employee also work because they're part-time for another company, and they have an agreement with that other company saying that the company owns all the IP. So not only you didn't protect the IP for the startup, even if you had an assignment clause like for saying that employee would assign his IP to your company, because that other company that the other employee was working for had another restriction on the half-time employee, like they can then make a claim on your IP saying that it was through like their employee. So that becomes messy, and especially if they're a bigger company, you will not have legal resources or the best lawyers like to argue with them. Or even if you do have some money, you would prefer to use that money for continuing to develop your product.
Right.
So instead
that's
of just
why
legal,
I think a lot of small businesses, whether they're an existing small business or a startup, make the mistake of not taking preventative measures. Right.
Yes. And
it's kind of like health. If you do preventative,
100%.
treatment, that's the best thing for longevity.
Yep. And also like just it's actually a lot cheaper because
people think it's not gonna happen to me.
Yep. So I would rather not pay this like 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 or 10,000 now, but later on it costs them much more, hundreds, like if not more. Yeah.
So on our next episode, we'll cover a little bit about privacy laws as well as, raising funds. And we'll go into, the common themes of raising funds and common problems that arise there and what tips we can offer. Thank you for coming on. All right. See you guys next time.